Okay, friends, this is our intro to week 3 of our greater reading plan looking at the life of Peter. And this is not just the middle week, but it's the hinge week. So the first 2 weeks, we met Peter, saw Peter's early interactions with Jesus, saw Peter grow in his knowledge and understanding about what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, his knowledge and understanding of who Jesus was, all of those things. And the next 2 weeks will be about Peter's life as a leader in the early church. We'll see from his perspective the things that are happening within the early church. And this week here in the middle is that hinge week. It's the week where we see Peter witness the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. And it's the week where we see Jesus raised and Peter being a witness to that. So there's a lot this week. And what I like about this is that this is definitely a story that many of you are going to be familiar with. But as we've already seen the first 2 weeks, I think it will be even more apparent this week that in this greater plan, what we're looking at is not just the story of Jesus, but what we can learn about the story of Jesus when we try to intentionally see it through the eyes of one of the disciples. So I hope that you'll read the story in a way that you haven't ever read it before. When again, you try to look at it from Peter's perspective. Okay, so day 1, what are we going after? On Monday, we're going after John 13, the beginning of it, and Luke 22. Why are we putting these two things together? Well, I've told you before that John has a very different take on many of the events that happened in Jesus' life, including the Last Supper. So in Matthew, Mark, Luke, you have very similar accounts. It's where we get the idea of communion from. Jesus institutes communion at this Last Supper. But what Mark recounts that none of the others do is something that happens before the meal. And that is that Jesus takes it as an opportunity to wash his disciples' feet. So the John passage will take us through that, and then we'll jump from John into Luke to see the rest of what happened that evening. So you'll see as you read them together how these two things work together. And I think what's worth thinking about there is, what does it mean to have a rabbi? And remember, Peter has Jesus as his rabbi, but we do too. We're seeking to be disciples of his. We're seeking to apprentice in life with Jesus also. We're seeking for Jesus to be the one who helps us to understand how best to live, how best to navigate this life. What does it mean that Peter has, and by extension, what does it mean that we have a rabbi, a leader, who intentionally seeks a downward trajectory when he could seek an upward trajectory? We'll see this in the next day's reading also when we get to the garden. But here we see it. He could seek to be served. In fact, many people are seeking to serve him. But he seeks to wash the disciples' feet. He could seek to be honored in this meal, but he seeks to use this meal as a means by which to tell the disciples what will be happening to him the next day. That the bread is his body, and that the wine is his blood, and that he will be giving himself for them. So I think, hopefully you've got your field book, and maybe take some notes as we talk, but also write down some questions. And I think the question for Monday's reading is that, what does it mean that I have a rabbi who intentionally seeks a downward trajectory? Okay. All right, day 2 on Tuesday. We continue with that last night of Jesus' life. So Monday ends after the Last Supper, and then we get into the other things that happen that night on Tuesday. Again, look at them from Peter's perspective. It starts with this strange interaction between Jesus and Peter, where Jesus calls him Simon, and remember, he's changed his name from Simon to Peter. It's almost like he's reminding Peter of where he came from. And then he says that, well, let me get it right here. Make sure that I get it right. He talks about how Satan has demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. What does that mean? Well, here's the first thing to know. That demanded to have you, it should be demanded to have y'all, okay? It's plural. And it's not just about Peter, but it's about all of these followers. Who is Satan? Well, remember who Satan is just in the Gospels. He's the great tempter. He's the one who tempts Jesus at the beginning. And you may remember this, at the beginning of Luke, after Jesus withstands the temptations, it says that Satan departed until an opportune time. Well, what Jesus knows is that this is the time when Satan's coming back. What I've always associated that with is like Satan coming back and tempting him again in the garden, and maybe there's something to that. You'll read about the Garden of Gethsemane in this also. But I think what we really see here clearly is that when Satan comes back at this opportune time, he's not coming and he's tempting Jesus. He's coming and he's tempting Jesus' followers. He tempts Judas and Judas falls into it. And Jesus knows that he will tempt Peter also. You'll see later that he encourages Peter on 2 occasions to pray that you may not enter into temptation. He knows that he's going to tempt Peter. And he says that you might be sifted like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. But Peter, I'm going to ask you in a minute to pray for yourself, but you need to know that I also am praying for you, that your faith won't fail in the moment of temptation. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. It's as if he knows you will give into the temptation. But I know that your faith won't fail ultimately, that you'll turn back. And when you do, strengthen the other disciples. You're going to fail, but you're going to then turn back to me. And when you do, strengthen them. Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. And you'll see as you keep reading that happens. So as you're in this day, again, picturing the last night of Jesus' life, see it from Peter's perspective. It may give you more sympathy for him. Why is it that he ultimately denies Jesus? Well, if you really get into this story, what you'll recognize is that in Peter's mind, it's a lost cause. In Peter's mind, there's nothing that he can do to save Jesus. So admitting that he knows Jesus will not save Jesus, and it will put him in peril. I mean, he's watching Jesus on trial. He's watching the way that he's being treated. And he knows, if I admit that I know him, the same thing could happen to me. And nothing good will happen for Jesus. So try to get in it from his perspective. You then get into the Garden of Gethsemane, the arrest of Jesus, all of those things, and the denial there at the end. And notice that the last time that Peter and Jesus make eye contact is right after Peter denies him. So kind of live in that. So on this day, again, continue to reflect on what you did with day 1. What does it mean that I have a rabbi who willingly does this? And then also try to get yourself in Peter's shoes and ask yourself questions about the temptations that you experience in your life, okay? Those temptations that come along, and what it means to be someone who is praying that I won't be caught up into temptation, like Jesus encourages the disciples to pray, okay? Day 3, we skip all the way to the resurrection. And you may think, that's crazy. Why not talk about the death of Jesus? You know why we're not talking about the death of Jesus? Because Peter wasn't there. I mean, even when I went back and reviewed the passages that we had picked, I thought, it's kind of weird that we're not talking about the death. But then I remembered, but the reason is because we were trying to see Peter's story here, and Peter was MIA. Peter denies him. We don't know what happens after that. He certainly has heard about what happened, but he's not there. So imagine what that Friday and Saturday were like for Peter. When he knows that Jesus is dead, he has no hope that there will be any kind of a resurrection. And he's just waiting. So it's kind of like a silent time. We then get right into the resurrection. We'll be looking at Luke's resurrection account. Matthew, Mark, and John also have accounts, but we'll be looking at Luke's. Look at that, and what I think we should reflect on that day is what's gotten into Peter. Because the other disciples, they don't immediately run to the tomb to see what's going on. You'll get more color when you read it. But Peter does. I had a mentor of mine say one time that it's almost as if Peter is just thinking, if there's even a chance. Seems crazy. Doesn't make any sense that the tomb would be empty, that Jesus would be raised. Doesn't make any sense. But if there's a chance, I'm going to go. So he goes. And what we've reflected on before is that this is a moment where the impossible and the undeniable collide. And that's a good question for us. What do we do when what seems to be impossible also becomes undeniable? See the idea that it's impossible that God could forgive me, but yet, that's what the scripture teaches, and I have this sense that even this thing that I did can be forgiven. With the impossible and the undeniable, when they collide. Some time thinking about the resurrection. Two more. We're going to look at John 1 on Thursday. I'm going to be talking about this in the sermon on Sunday. I'm recording this on Thursday. So by the time you get this, I will have preached that sermon. And this is what we're going to be going after. So I'll leave a lot of that commentary to that day. But what's happening here is that you see that Peter is going back to his old ways. He's fishing. Jesus is raised, but he certainly doesn't think that he can still be a disciple. Jesus is back, and that's great, but I no longer have a job with him, is certainly what he's thinking. So he goes back to fishing. And then there's this amazing encounter that likely happens at the same place that Luke 5 happened. Don't remember Luke 5? Go back. That was our second day of reading. Go check that out. Likely happens at the same place, and it's this beautiful picture of Jesus restoring the relationship with Peter. So check that out. And then the last day, we'll round out this week with Matthew 28, the end of Matthew, which is the Great Commission, where Jesus commissions the disciples. He sends them out into the world. And you'll see there's the specific instruction that he gives. And what you'll notice, and what we often miss in there, is that it's not just about telling people about Jesus, and it's not just about baptizing them, but it's about teaching people. Remember, what it means to be a disciple of Jesus is not just to believe that Jesus existed. It is to learn from him, to learn the way of life that he lives. What Peter and the others are sent out to do is not just to tell people about Jesus and to see them baptized, but to teach them how to live this way. And then what we'll get into next week, which I cannot wait for, is the story of this early church that Peter is at the very center of. It's the story of what God begins to do through Peter and these other early followers of Jesus, the disciples, but many others that are around also, including many, many women that were following Jesus. They form this core community, this new kind of community that comes to be known as the church. And it grows like crazy. And right at the center is our guy, Peter, who started out as just an ordinary guy, who then was so afraid on the last night of Jesus' life that he denied him, who now is living and acting with an unbelievable boldness. And next week, we're really going to hammer home where that boldness comes from, where it is that Peter gets this. So God bless you, friends. I hope you have a great week of reading. Reach out to myself or to any of our staff if you have questions, and we can talk through those things. But happy reading individually. I hope you have good conversations with your small group, and I'll see you again next week as we get into the book of Acts together. God bless you.